She was 21 years old, and she had $40 and a broken-down blacksmith's hammer that had belonged to a dead man, and that was everything she owned in the world. We at Homestead Stories have come across many tales of people who found themselves starting over with almost nothing. But the story of Nettie Colwell is one that stayed with us. Because what Nettie did with $40 and a piece of forgotten land that the whole county called cursed, well, it changed her life, and it changed the people around her in ways none of them expected. If you've ever believed that the thing everyone else is running from might be exactly what you need to run toward, then this story is for you. Nettie Colwell was born in the hill country of western Tennessee, the second child of a woman named Ruth, who was warm and loud, and who kept a garden that smelled of tomato vines and turned earth. Ruth died when Nettie was 8, from a fever that came on in March and didn't leave. After that, the house went quiet in a way that an 8-year-old doesn't have the words to describe, but carries in her chest for the rest of her life. Her father, Harlan Colwell, was a decent man made small by grief. He remarried 2 years later, a woman named Dorothea from the next county over, who was precise and efficient, and who regarded Nettie the way you might regard a leaky faucet. A problem you tolerate because fixing it outright would cause more fuss than it was worth. Dorothea had 2 daughters of her own, both younger, and the family reorganized itself around them the way a river reorganizes itself around new stones. Nettie was not included in the new shape of things, but the forge was. Across the road from the Colwell property stood a blacksmith shop that had been there since before anyone could remember. It belonged to a man named August Frey, who was in his late 60s, who had no family left, and whose hands were so scarred from decades at the anvil that they looked like the bark of an old oak. Frey was not what you would call approachable. He rarely smiled, rarely spoke, and kept to himself with the kind of deliberateness that told you it was a choice, not a lack of personality. But Nettie had started appearing at the edge of his property when she was 9. She didn't ask for anything, she just watched. One afternoon, without a word, August Frey set a short length of iron rod and a pair of tongs on the low stone wall at the edge of his lot and went back inside. Nettie sat there for 20 minutes looking at them before she picked them up. By the following week, she was inside the shop. He taught her everything he knew, in the way of old craftsmen, not by explaining, but by doing, and letting her see. He taught her how to read the color of hot iron, how a piece ready for hammering goes from black to cherry to bright orange to the particular white-yellow that means you've got maybe 3 strikes before it cools wrong. He taught her how to listen to the hammer, how a clean strike sounds different from a glancing one, how the ring of the anvil changes when the metal is just right. She learned to draw steel out into a taper, to bend curves, to set a rivet so it would hold for 50 years. She learned how to shoe a horse, and how to repair a wagon wheel hub, and how to make a simple gate hinge from raw bar stock. Frey never told her she was good. He didn't need to. When she welded her first chain link, a tricky operation that requires the metal to be heated to just below burning, and then struck quickly and precisely. He took it from her, held it up to the light, pulled on both ends, and set it down again without comment. That silence was the highest praise she had ever received. For her 17th birthday, he gave her a hammer. It was a cross-peen hammer he had made himself, the head forged from tool steel and the handle a piece of hickory he'd shaped on his own lathe, balanced so perfectly that it felt like an extension of your arm. The head was engraved with a single small letter. F, for Frey. She never went anywhere without it. The morning she was put out of her father's house, she was 21 years old. It was a Friday in early April. Dorothea had come into the kitchen while Nettie was making coffee, and she'd set an envelope on the table and said, simply, that Nettie needed to be gone by the end of the month, that Harlan agreed, and that there was $40 in the envelope to help her get somewhere else. Nettie didn't argue. She had seen this coming the way you see a storm building on the horizon for 2 days before it arrives. She picked up the envelope and said, "All right." Her father was sitting in the front room. She paused in the doorway and looked at him. He didn't look up from the newspaper in his hands. His silence wasn't angry, it was just absent. Harlan Colwell had been absent for 13 years, sitting in rooms, breathing air, and simply not being there. Nettie felt the old hollow ache, and then she let it be. There was no use in grief for something that had been lost a long time ago. She packed her canvas duffel, a change of clothes, a bar of soap, the worn copy of her mother's recipe book she'd kept hidden in a sock drawer, and August Frey's hammer, wrapped in a piece of chamois cloth. She shouldered the bag, walked out the front door, and didn't close it behind her because she had no reason to be gentle with that house anymore. She was on the road by mid-morning. She walked west because west felt like the direction of things she didn't know yet. She had $40 and a hammer, and the particular kind of calm that comes over a person when everything has already happened and there's nothing left to dread. By the second day, she had crossed into a broader, emptier country. Limestone ridges rising out of rolling pasture, the sky enormous and pale above her, the smell of cedar and red clay in the air. She slept the first night in the hayloft of a farm, whose owners left the door unlatched, and the second night under an oak tree with her bag for a pillow. She ate bread and dried apples from the crossroads store at the county line, and washed her face in a creek and kept walking. On the third day, she reached the town of Tallow Creek. It was a small place. A grain elevator, a post office, a diner, a hardware store, and a scattering of houses that looked like they'd been set down wherever seemed convenient and left to settle in. The road into town ran along the bank of an actual creek, narrow and clean, lined with willows that dragged their branches in the current. She went into the hardware store because hardware stores were where she felt most comfortable and because she needed to ask someone about work. The man behind the counter was named Pershing Webb, a lanky man in his 50s, with a white mustache and the kind of eyes that missed very little. He looked her over without embarrassment and asked what kind of work she did. "Metalwork mostly," she said. "Blacksmithing. Some general repair." He looked at the hammer handle sticking out of her bag and then back at her face. "You any good?" "I'm competent," she said, which was something August Frey would have said, and it felt right. Pershing Webb told her that the old town farrier had retired 2 years ago and hadn't been replaced, and that people drove their horses clear into the next county for shoeing, which was a nuisance. He told her there was a shop space, a lean-to forge, attached to the old Webb family livery barn that had been sitting empty for 8 years and was available for very little. He told her that his cousin Henry owned it, and Henry would probably let her use it if she kept it in good repair. And then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a piece of land available on the south edge of town. Small cabin on it, right on the creek. He glanced at his feet when he said it, the way people do when they're about to say something they know sounds foolish. "Why is it available?" Nettie asked. He took a moment. "Place has a reputation," he said carefully. "Been empty for going on 12 years. Before that, different people tried to settle there and none of them stayed. Something seems to go wrong. Animal gets sick. Roof caves in. Marriage falls apart." He shrugged. "Folks around here call it the Holt land. Old name, most people won't go near it." Nettie thought about that. "Is there something structurally wrong with it?" "Cabin standing," he said. "Creek still runs. Land's good. It's just the feeling of the place." She asked what the county wanted for it. He told her $40. She almost laughed. Henry Webb, Pershing's cousin, a round-faced man who seemed slightly embarrassed to be parting with even a cursed piece of property for so little, drew up the deed the next morning. Nettie counted out her $40 in 5s and 10s on his kitchen table, every cent she had, and signed her name at the bottom of the page. Henry shook her hand and looked relieved that it was over. The land was a half-mile south of town, down a path that wandered through a stand of old sycamores before opening into a small, level clearing. The cabin sat at the clearing's edge where the land met the creek bank. It had been built from hand-cut limestone blocks, good, solid construction, with a cedar shake roof that had shed most of its shakes on the north side and a chimney that leaned slightly but held. The door was padlocked. The previous owner, whoever that had been last, had at least secured it before leaving. 2 windows, both intact. A covered porch that sagged on the east end where a support post had rotted through at the base. Standing in that clearing with the creek running behind her and the sycamores making their papery sound in the wind, Nettie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter. A kind of readiness. She walked around the cabin 3 times before she went inside. The interior was 1 room, maybe 15 feet by 18, with a sleeping loft above. The floor was packed earth, covered by a layer of old pine boards, some of them warped. The fireplace was wide and deep, built from the same limestone as the walls, with an iron crane for hanging pots. She checked the crane and it was sound. Good work. Whoever had built this cabin had known what they were doing with stone. She spent the first week on the roof. She found a stand of young cedars back in the sycamore grove and felled 6 of them, limbed them out, and used August Frey's draw knife. She'd traded a woman at the crossroads store a pair of mended scissors for an old draw knife she'd spotted hanging on the wall to split them into shakes. It was slow work, and her hands ached by the end of each day, but the shakes she made were tight and clean, and she laid them with a careful overlap that would shed rain for years. She replaced the rotted porch post with a new cedar post she'd squared herself with the draw knife, mortised it into the sill plate the old way, and pegged it with a wooden dowel soaked in linseed oil. She rehung the door on new iron hinges she forged herself in the lean-to shop, working the small fire she'd built in the forge from charcoal she'd bought from Pershing Webb. The hinges were heavy and true, and when she fit them to the door and swung it, it moved without sound. The forge was her livelihood and her peace. Word got out, the way word does in small towns, that a young woman had set up at the old Webb livery and could shoe a horse. The first few customers came cautiously, the way people approach something that violates their expectations. A man named Theodore K. brought his draft horse on a Tuesday morning and stood watching with his arms crossed while Nettie worked. When she was done and had set the last nail and clinched it over and tapped it flat, he walked around the horse twice and looked at all 4 feet and said, which in Theodore K.'s vocabulary apparently meant something like "I am surprised and satisfied." She got $5 for that job. She used 2 of it to buy a sack of cornmeal and some salt pork, and the rest went into a tin box under the porch. Within 2 months, she was shoeing horses twice a week and doing small repair work between gate latches, wagon hardware, a broken cultivator blade, and the tin box was growing. The people of Tallow Creek watched her work and made up their minds about her, and most of them made up their minds in her favor. Not because they were especially kind, but because competence in a small town is a currency that transcends most other things. It was in that second month that she found the thing under the forge. The lean-to forge had an old stone base, a raised platform of fitted limestone where the forge hearth sat, and one edge of it had heaved up over the years, cracked right down the middle by a frost that had gotten in underneath. She needed to repair it, or eventually the hearth would list and become unsafe. She borrowed a long iron bar from Pershing Webb and a stone roller from the lot behind the livery, and over 2 days, she worked at levering the cracked section free. When she got the larger piece of limestone lifted and shifted to the side, there was a hollow beneath it, not deep, not large, but clearly deliberate. Someone had dug it out by hand. Inside the hollow, wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth and tied with baling wire, was a bundle about the size of a large book. Nettie sat back on her heels for a moment and looked at it. The light coming through the gaps in the lean-to walls made stripes across the dirt floor. She could hear the creak through the sycamores. She brought the bundle out to the light, set it on her workbench, and used August Frey's penknife to cut the wire. The oilcloth came away in careful layers. Inside was a tin deed box, the old kind with a hinged lid, and inside the deed box were 3 things. The first was a roll of currency. Old bills, carefully wrapped in a strip of muslin. She counted it out on the bench, $220. The second was a photograph, sepia-toned and slightly faded, of a woman and a girl standing in front of the cabin. The woman looked to be 40 or so, broad-shouldered and squinting into the sun. The girl was maybe 12, and she had the same serious set to her mouth as the woman. On the back of the photograph, in careful pencil, Margaret and Rose Holt, September 1897. The third was a letter, folded twice, on paper that had gone amber with age. Nettie sat down on the ground right there, on the dirt floor of the lean-to, the letter in her hands, and read, "To whoever is reading this, my name is Margaret Holt. I came to this land in 1891 with my husband, Frederick, who was a blacksmith by trade, which is how this forge came to be here. We built the cabin and the forge together, with our daughter Rose and with the help of our neighbors, who were good people. Frederick died in the winter of 1894 from a chest infection that should not have killed him, but did. I stayed on. I had my daughter and my work. I am not a woman who leaves easily. Rose and I managed the forge and the garden for 3 years. We were not prosperous, but we were solid. I saved every dollar I could. I had a plan to send Rose east to a school that trained women as teachers. She was bright enough for it, and she wanted it so badly she could hardly sleep. Then the summer of '97, Rose took sick. Not the same fever as her father. Something slower. By September she was thin and tired, and by November she was gone. She was 14 years old. I cannot describe what followed. I will not try. I kept the forge going through that winter because I did not know what else to do. But by spring I knew I could not stay. The sound of the creek, the way the light came through the sycamores in the morning, everything was her, and I could not bear it. The money in this box was for Rose. It was her future, saved dollar by dollar over 6 years, every extra cent from every job I could find. I could not spend it. It did not feel like mine to spend. So I am leaving it here, under the forge her father built in the place where we made it, because that is where it belongs. If you have found this and you are in need, use it. Do not feel that you are taking something that isn't yours. It has been waiting for someone who would use it well. I hope you are someone who will build something good in this place. The cabin and the land have a reputation, I know. People have told me things went wrong here after I left. I think what happened is simpler. People came to this place and felt the weight of our sorrow in its walls, and they could not settle into it. Grief does that to a place. It lingers. But I do not believe a place is cursed. I believe a place can be healed. There is one last thing I ask, if you are willing. Behind the forge under the east window of the cabin, I planted a rosebush the spring before Rose died. If it has survived, I would be grateful if you would tend it. She chose it herself from a catalog. It was her only vanity. She wanted something beautiful for the window. I wish you well. I hope this place gives you what it gave us before it gave us sorrow. It gave us a home. Margaret Holt, May 1898. Nettie sat for a long time after she finished reading, the letter in her lap, the sound of the creak steady through the walls. The $220 lay on the workbench above her, and they felt suddenly enormous, not because of their value but because of what they represented. 6 years of work and hope, saved for a girl who never got to use them. A mother's love distilled into paper and numbers, and the act of leaving it behind rather than erasing it. She thought about her own mother, Ruth, who had kept a garden. She thought about August Frey, who had given her a hammer and a skill and never said a word about why. She thought about what it meant to leave something good behind you, to trust that whoever comes next will know what to do with it. She walked around the cabin to the east window. The rosebush was there. It had grown large and untended, sprawling out from its original planting, thorny and tangled but unmistakably alive. It had not bloomed yet this year. It was still early spring, but the new growth at the tips of the canes was a deep, healthy red. Nettie spent the better part of an afternoon cutting it back carefully, removing the dead wood, tying the canes to a simple trellis she fashioned from cedar branches and baling wire. She did it the way Frey had taught her to approach any repair, patiently, reading what was there before you imposed anything on it. The money changed everything in the way that having a foundation to build on changes everything. It didn't do the work for her, but it meant the work she did could amount to something. She bought proper smithing coal instead of charcoal. She bought a second-hand bellows from a forge sale 3 counties over. She bought good quality iron rod and flat stock and kept an inventory for the first time. She bought glass for a proper window in the forge and a second-hand vise that she bolted to the bench with bolts she turned herself on a borrowed screw plate. She went to Pershing Webb and asked him who in Tallow Creek might need consistent repair work done. Farm equipment, mostly spring planting time being what it was. He gave her a list of 7 names, and she called on each of them, direct and without apology, and came away with 6 steady accounts. She repaired the cabin's porch completely. She built a proper kitchen workshelf along the cabin's north wall and fitted it with iron hooks she'd forged herself for hanging tools and pots. She built a small woodshed against the east wall and stacked it full before the summer was out. She chinked the gaps in the cabin walls. With a mortar she mixed from creek sand and lime she burned herself, working slowly and carefully on the weakest sections first, and then working her way around. And slowly, carefully, Tallow Creek began to change the way it talked about the Holt land. It started with Theodore K., who told someone at the feed store that the new girl at the old Webb Forge did good work. Then a woman named Alma Parrish started bringing her wagon repair to Nettie, instead of driving to the county seat, and she mentioned to her church group that the cabin on the creek was looking well kept. Pershing Webb told a customer that the young woman who'd taken the Holt land had more sense than most men he'd hired in 20 years. Nobody called it the cursed land in the same way anymore. It had a new name now, Nettie Colwell's place. A month after she found Margaret Holt's letter, a woman named Calistide came to the door of the forge. She was in her 60s, stout and deliberate, with an expression that suggested she had made up her mind about most things and was only rarely persuaded to revise. She introduced herself as someone who had known Margaret Holt back when. Nettie offered her a seat on the bench outside, and they sat together in the late afternoon, the creek making its sound below them. Calistide said that Margaret Holt had been the best farrier in 3 counties and the most stubborn woman she had ever liked. She said that after Rose died and Margaret left, nobody ever heard from her again, and the town had carried a low-grade guilt about it ever since. The feeling that they had not done enough, that they had let her go without fighting for her. She said that the place had been called cursed, partly because it was easier to have a supernatural explanation than to admit that a good woman had simply been broken by grief, and nobody had known how to help her. Nettie told her what she had found under the forge. She didn't show Calla the letter. It felt private, but she told her about it, and about the money, and about Margaret Holt's words. Calla Steed sat quietly for a long time after that. Then she said, "That sounds like her." She didn't elaborate, but her voice had something in it that Nettie recognized as the particular weight of old love. After that, Calla came by once or twice a week. She brought things. A jar of put-up tomatoes, a set of curtains she had made from feedsack cloth that turned out to fit Nettie's windows almost exactly. She told Nettie things about Margaret and Rose. Small things, the kind you don't tell to just anyone. That Rose had been allergic to bee stings and terrified of spiders despite being otherwise entirely fearless. That Margaret had never raised her voice in anger but could silence a room with a look. That the rosebush at the east window had bloomed yellow that first spring, and Margaret had laughed out loud at it because the catalog had said red. Nettie listened and said little, and let the stories settle into the cabin the way warmth settles into stone. By the time the first frost came, she had 6 steady accounts, a weather-tight cabin, a functioning forge, and a small but real community of people who knew her name and knew her work. She had fixed the lean-to stone base properly, using the skills Frey had never formally taught her, but that she had learned by watching and doing. She had remortared the chimney and straightened its lean. She had built a new front gate from iron bar stock, a simple design, 2 vertical bars and 3 horizontal, with a rosette she'd forged at the top of each post, small and unpretentious and her own. On a morning in late October, when the sycamores had gone yellow, and their leaves were falling in slow rotations into the creek, she fulfilled the last promise she had made to Margaret Holt's letter. She went to the east window and looked at the rosebush, which had gone to hips now, the blooms long gone and the canes settling into their dormant state. She had never seen it flower. She had only seen the catalog page Calla had shown her, torn from an old issue she'd saved. A yellow climbing rose, goldfinch variety, nearly scentless but prolific. Next spring, Calla had told her, "You'll see it next spring." Nettie put her hand on one of the canes for a moment, feeling the small thorns and the papery texture of the bark. Then she went inside. On the mantel above the fireplace she had built a small shelf, and on that shelf she kept 2 things. August Frey's cross-peen hammer, its hickory handle, worn to the color of old honey, the letter F engraved on the head, and beside it, propped against the limestone, the photograph of Margaret and Rose Holt standing in front of the cabin, squinting into the September sun. She lit the fire that evening and listened to the wind come down from the ridge and rattle the sycamores. The cabin held it, the walls she had repointed, and the windows she had reglazed, and the chimney she had rebuilt, all held together and kept the cold where the cold belonged. The fire in the hearth that Frederick Holt had built threw its warmth across the room, and Nettie sat in it and felt something she had been carrying in her chest since she was 8 years old begin, slowly and without drama, to ease. She thought about August Frey, who had set a piece of iron and a pair of tongs on a wall and trusted a 9-year-old girl to know what they were for. She thought about Margaret Holt, who had saved $220 for a daughter who never got to use them, and had trusted a stranger to carry it forward. She thought about the photograph on the mantel, mother and daughter, serious-faced in the sun, and she felt a thread between them, long and fine, stretched across years and grief, held together by the simple human act of leaving something good behind. The world had put her out on the road with $40 and a dead man's hammer. And this place, this cabin everyone had run from, this land everyone called cursed, had given it back to her. Given it back doubled and redoubled. A home, a trade, people who knew her name. Nettie Colwell was 21 years old and had spent every cent she owned on a piece of land no one wanted. It was the best $40 she ever spent. We think about that sometimes. The places people flee, and the places people choose to stay. And we wonder, is there a place or a person in your life that everyone else seems to have given up on, that you alone see something worth building toward? We'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if Nettie's story found you at the right moment, we hope you'll stay with us here at Homestead Stories. There are more like this one waiting.